everybody to our February TPA membership meeting. Thanks so much for everybody for joining us today. Before we get started, I'm just going to go over a couple quick housekeeping items. We are recording the session today, so as we typically do at the conclusion of the meeting, we will send everybody an email on Monday, usually Monday afternoon, with follow-up materials and a link to the recorded session. Um, if you want to ask a question, you can use the chat and the Q&A. Both of those have been enabled. And we in the announcement, we indicated that we will be doing our breakout groups again today. So about 9:45, if you registered for the meeting, you'll get an email from us that has a link to the meeting that has the breakout rooms in it. It will also be posting that link in the chat closer to the end of the meeting. So hopefully we'll see you for the 10 to 10:30 time slot for breakouts. And with that, I'll turn it over to Patrick to take it away.
Thank you, Craig, and good morning, everybody. You want to get us into official meeting mode, Craig? We'll get started here. So just a few things that we wanted to announce. There are a few live events coming up that we wanted to make sure that we make everyone aware of. So PA Tech Accelerator. So I know that we had Shay Tanis and Kaylee Day from PA Tech Accelerator with us last month. Provided some information. These sessions have opened in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and we just wanted to promote that. We know that they, I think, are pretty close to sold out, if they may even be sold out by now. So I think a couple hundred in each location. So glad to hear the enthusiasm around those sessions. We want to make sure you're aware of that. Those will be at Temple University and at Carlow College, so East and West, pretty similar to what ODP had sponsored a few years ago under the tech initiative. So it's a full day of events, so we certainly want to promote that. I also want to ask for your help as members, because I know with our Human Services and Life Steps, having done some tech fairs and opening assistive technology centers, we really want to hear your stories as well as some of the things that you see as continuing challenges in the adoption and implementation of technology across your programs and to help individuals. So I think as prepared as we can kind of be to engage in some discussion at those sessions would be very helpful. So please, if you can, send information to us and questions to us, but most importantly, we want to make sure that you're aware of these upcoming sessions. Representative Dan Miller's annual Disability and Mental Health Summit, those dates have been set. It's really May the 8th is going to be the summit day. Special Olympics is doing a Cities of Inclusion the following day, which I know Rep Miller is going to be involved with and supporting, but May the 8th will be the date that the Disability Summit occurs. Kind of the same format as the last few years. It is at a different venue, so it is going to be at Allegheny County Community College on the north side. There will be legislative panel discussions that day. TPA will actually be doing an online session in advance of the summit, so we'll have an online session that we're going to do on performance-based contracting. We're going to actually try to gear it toward, as the summit itself is, families, individuals, have a little bit broader messaging. You know, ODP had recently done a performance-based contracting webinar for families. So TPA will be very actively involved in this. We want to promote all of our members attending. We are going to also do our annual Legislative Appreciation and IDA Awareness event luncheon at the summit. So that's something we've done the last several years. Unlike previous years, we are not going to really host a captive session or do a meeting. We are just really going to ask members and the community itself to sort of bring your legislators along, extend invitations. It's a great event. There's a resource fair. A lot of you set up exhibit tables. So we want it to be a little more casual. Certainly thank our legislators, get as many of them there as possible, and be in a position to really talk about the important messages and all the things that happen across the IDA community. So looking forward to that event. And we are booked for our annual conference in Cranberry Township at the Regional Learning Alliance. So many members attended, and many members also helped us out with sponsorships and exhibit tables. So we're hoping to have another great event in July. So not too soon to get that out there. Ask everybody to mark that down on your calendars. We'll have sort of more to report, some save the date, start to build the program. And we are expecting that Kristen and Jennifer Newell and all the folks from ODP that have been attending in the past have that date as well. So we hope to have a very similar session, do a few different things as well. So if you can go next slide, Craig. You know, we know certainly that the budget is obviously a hot topic. And it's a very polarizing issue right now. So we're going to spend a lot of today talking about what's going on with budget. And obviously, when I say hot topic, this involves not just the state budget that was just released, but of course, all the activity that's going on at the federal level that really has a major influence and potential impact on what goes on in Pennsylvania and in other states regarding services to people with intellectual disabilities and autism. So we know this is an important issue. We've been watching it very closely. We had authored a commentary just sort of on the Pennsylvania budget. There's a few things that we'll go through just in terms of up-to-date materials, some of the advocacy work that we continue to do, and some of the things that we want to open up as opportunities for members to be aware of and also have opportunity to communicate with your federal legislators as well. So a few things that we will go through today, and I'll just comment briefly upon a few things that are kind of new. Craig mentioned the breakout sessions, which I'll kind of end with on this slide. But we'll give a federal budget update. We'll sort of do an overview. A lot has occurred over the last 30 days or so, so we want to kind of get caught up with what is current today. The Pennsylvania budget IDA implications. ODP will be with us today. Jennifer Newell will be joining us to do a presentation. We also believe Kristen is going to join us as well to help support, answer any program content types of questions, some other implications, issues that have come up along the way since the budget was passed, or not passed, but the executive budget by the governor was released. Certainly, performance-based contracting is a topic that we want to get into today, make sure everybody is aware, up to date. Certainly, the portal is open for performance measures to be uploaded for tier assignment applications. And a couple of things that I also want to mention. We've recently done a TPA weekly poll, if you've noticed. When we put out the weekly update every Monday, we sort of get everybody caught up on the happenings in the industry, within membership, and various other topics and subjects. And for the last several weeks, we've been doing questions. We're really intending to use this as an engagement tool to hear from members. This week's question really related to kind of directly what's going on potentially at the federal level. We had a question that kind of framed by the statement, federal lawmakers are looking at significant cuts to Medicaid. If this occurs, do you believe that there will be more admissions to Pennsylvania's IDA state centers? And not a huge sample size, but 78% of the people who responded said, yes, that's likely to occur. So if you have a question, a topic you would like to explore, I think over time we would like to sort of use this as a way to open discussion on certain topics, but also put out questions that you might be interested in hearing the response of members from your perspective. So please feel free to submit those questions and ideas to us. Also, I want to mention that with our TPA Board of Directors, every year I think we sort of approach our annual meeting in June. And based on some feedback last year, the board is met. We are undergoing a scenario where there's some leadership change happening. Ruth Siegfried, our president for the past many years, is turning the presidency over, and we really are looking at leadership succession within TPA. And we're also interested in looking at people who continue to be interested in serving on our board. So we want to continue to have a very diverse and inclusive board in every way, representing membership in a very representative fashion. So to do that, we just want to make sure that board process and the participation in board activities. I don't suspect we're going to have many openings, but we are also open to having people attend a meeting, learn more about it, talk to us about it, talk to other board members. And we're hopeful that at the July conference, we had a greater presence than the previous year last year, and we'd like to do a little bit more with the board involvement in that event as well, and also making sure that board members interact directly with folks who attend the conference, which are not all TPA members. So the last thing that I'll talk about is our breakout sessions. Again, something that we are intending to pilot for now as an opportunity for some engagement. These sessions in webinar format don't always give us that opportunity, and we try to present a lot of information, bring in a lot of guests, so that also doesn't really lend itself for us to have open discussion. So please attend the breakouts and also let us know what you think. I think we have two great sessions today. They're going to be led by Tom Krofchek, who's been chairing our Financial Management Committee, and by Karen Jacobson, who has been chairing our Human Resources Committee, to sort of talk about some of the topics of the day. Budget, probably we expect largely directed toward performance-based contracting in the financial management session. And then we are on the heels of a compensation study that was published very recently. So Karen is going to tackle that topic and hopefully take a little bit deeper dive in some of that very important data. So Craig, we can go on to the next slide. And I just want to go through a couple of quick areas and items before we kind of look at the Pennsylvania budget. This is something that I kind of want to frame out as not a new slide for people that have attended recent meetings. This dates back to last September 25th when we made an ask of the governor. And certainly when we get into the details of the budget, and many of you probably already know this, but in a perfect world, we identify everything that we need accurately and we get that money appropriated and it solves all of our problems. So, we had offered a commentary on this, as I said earlier. We really kind of want to look at what does this budget mean and what does our continued work look like in terms of advocacy. We have made some progress. The report that came from our compensation study identifies progress in a few areas, one area in particular, but we have to continue this work. And I think there are opportunities to do that. So the things that we want to do next are really sort of leverage off the opportunities that we have, the investment that the governor has made, and the continued messaging around the importance of the IDA community. But as you will see as we go through here, these particular asks are not really addressed in the budget, but that is not to say we don't have opportunities to do them legislatively, to really look at the appropriation amount within performance-based contracting and the overall sort of top end dollar amount that's in the budget for IDA services. So we're going to take a look at all of that today. But I just want to go back and sort of level set with where we began. So if you can go next slide, Craig, a few things that we're going to want to really dive into. And again, this leads up to both today's discussion of budget and where we want to go ultimately in the breakout sessions. But relatively new material. The study was only released January 17th. So I think concurrently we sort of got the published study out. We use this piece of collateral. Again, I want to acknowledge, recognize, and express my gratitude to the other associations who we've worked with in a very effective way, I believe. We'll probably talk a little bit more about that throughout today's meeting. But this is sort of the top line takeaways and wage increase, vacancy factor, a reduction. I'll talk a little bit about that more in a moment. But these are the kind of things that we have historically over recent years compared. So we want to stick to these metrics to sort of be able to compare and show a comparison of prior years. And if you go next slide, Craig, this is sort of the remaining pieces of what we wanted to show. When we were advocating before the release of the budget, we were still hopeful and we were still attempting to get money in the budget to address rates. As I've alluded to, if not noted directly, of course, we don't see an increase in the budget for a rate increase for IDA services. But there are still issues that we want to tackle. There's still a lot of overtime being used. There are still a lot of agencies using contract staffing. You see the waiting list numbers. We certainly want to call that out. We know progress has been made, but it's still thousands of people not receiving services. And to just pause for a moment on the vacancy factor on the previous slide, 14% from where it was 23% the previous year. That is a pretty remarkable change. But the metric by itself doesn't necessarily indicate health of the system. Even in a conversation that I had with Kristen yesterday, we were openly acknowledging, and she really raised it. That's still a lot of folks. That's still not where you want to be. But relative to where we were in the past, it does show some movement from the investment that has been made into the system. So while we certainly want to call that out, I think in a session like from 10 to 10:30 with Karen in HR, look at some of the reasons behind that. There's certainly been contraction of the DSP workforce. That has an impact on that metric. So we certainly don't believe that the capacity is fully back. So we want to use this information, but we also have to make sure that we don't run away from any of it. We have to put out what is occurring. And a lot of it is very positive. It doesn't mean that it has solved all of our issues. And there's still many things that we want to advocate for. So if you go next slide, I think that the grid there at the bottom, I kind of wanted to blow out a little bit. And really, I think it's a very informative piece of information on this slide in terms of tracking ODP rate increases to actual published inflation from the Department of Labor, the federal government, and then kind of looking at what does our workforce look like from the surveys that I was just referencing. So in the insert there, you really sort of see what you don't see on the graph on the infographic is really what did the wages look like from these studies over the past several years. So that gives you an indication of what wages were really compiled. It's an aggregation, of course, when we do a study. So we know that that doesn't hit your exact data when we talk about vacancy or average wage, but it's a good benchmark for you to compare to. And it's also a good benchmark for us to look at in terms of what has moved within the system as a whole. So we did think it was important to kind of call out some of the data points that really don't appear on the infographic. You see sort of the 1785, but where were we just a few years ago? And I think everyone would recognize that is some significant movement. And again, it's north of 25%. The numbers you see there, if you did the math, really come back to a little bit below 25, but we have to benchmark against something as a starting point. So we're using 2020 data to sort of show in that first column. And I think what would be sort of more insightful here, if you really thought about from a regulatory standpoint, how often is ODP required to do a rate increase? For the next 3 years, they really wouldn't be required after the current fiscal year's increase. So you would see a flat line again going out several years, while of course inflation and therefore the rates that you're going to have to pay staff are going to continue to increase. So let's go to the next slide, Craig. So obviously, we know that this is a critical period for performance-based contracting. I think we're going to have a lot of that discussion today. So just some reminders. I think, Craig, you might drop these links in. People are probably very well aware of them, but the announcements that we just referenced on here. Obviously, the portal is open for every residential provider who has not already submitted tier assignment performance data. Everyone, again, is required to do that. That opened on February 15th. That data is due March 15th. Likewise, the pay for performance payments, the applications for those, and you can get full detail on what those are in the announcement 25015. That was just updated, I think, a few days ago. And we really strongly encourage everybody to submit and apply for these funds. So I know Tom intends to talk about that a little bit in his session later today as well. So a couple of these other things, there's the supports coordination timeline, just a reminder that that is also on track to be implemented during this current year. Actually won't be effective till next year, but there will be a lot of activity, a lot of materials put out there. And ODP does have a number of resources, webinars that are recorded, virtual office hours, FAQs posted. So please take a look at all of that. And of course, take advantage of the opportunity today to talk to your colleagues and with Tom in the breakout session at 10 o'clock. So at that point, Craig, if I'm not mistaken, I think we were to the budget slides I prepared. So, oh, sorry, I'm totally wrong. So let me frame this a little bit. This is kind of where we are with, as of yesterday, this was published. This isn't really new. $880 million in cuts. I think it was, I wasn't sure that that was actually the correct number being used on the anchor report, but I'll go with what we see on screen. We did add to our ACT page a lot of resources from Anchor in terms of how you can contact your direct senator in Pennsylvania, as well as the House member for your district. So if you go next slide, Craig, I just want to kind of quickly let people know that the fact sheet is out there. This is something that we have made sure that it is available to members. We've been closely tuned into what Anchor is reporting on this front. And then please visit the site in terms of background information as well. We have a lot of the state stuff that we're going to talk about today, but we also have put these resources from Anchor where you can actually use their action center. You can send a message directly to your senator and House member in Congress. And it really does lay out a lot of potential impact that would occur if there were cuts to the federal budget that would impact Medicaid services in Pennsylvania. When we get into the budget here in Pennsylvania, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But at this point, I want to introduce Jennifer Newell. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you being here. I know you've brought a slide deck along, but let me just give you a moment to say hi to our members and give us an opening comment or two if you'd like.
Sure. Thank you, Patrick. Good morning, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here with you today. We've prepared just a few updates regarding the budget and also some updates in terms of performance-based contracting, but I think Patrick's covered some of that, so I will try not to be too duplicative there. Very nice again to be here with you today. I think we're all rejoicing that we're just about 1 month away from the beginning of spring and hopefully out of this very cold weather. I'm sure we can all agree that it's just a little bit too cold here. So again, I'm going to just go through some updates for you. in terms of the state budget and a couple of other things this morning. So if you want to advance to the next slide, we can go ahead and get started. So you can see on this slide, there is a chart that just shows the Governor Shapiro's proposed budget for DHS for 25-26, which is around 21.17 billion, of which ODP's portion is around 3.23 billion. And we can advance to the next slide, please. This chart just shows what the increases for each of the program areas are. So you can see that for ODP, that is about $184 million increase to our budget for 24 or 25-26, which is really a result of annualizing the rate increases and continuing the multi-year program growth strategy. Next slide, please. As a reminder, in 24-25, the Shapiro administration began a multi-year strategy to expand access to home and community-based services and effectively end the emergency waiting list. In that year, that strategy resulted in about $280 million in funding for new rates to support the workforce, as well as $74.8 million to begin the process of eliminating the adult emergency waiting list. We're very pleased to share with you some of the success that we've seen. Patrick mentioned a little bit earlier, the DSP vacancy rate is now around 14%, which is the lowest that it's been since 2015. And we've also seen the waiver capacity increase by about 1,300 people since the beginning of July 2024. So again, as I mentioned, the 25-26 budget annualizes the rate increases as well as our ability to continue to work on the multi-year program growth strategy. You can go to the next slide, please. Just some updates in terms of the growth strategy. Effective January 1st, all of the AEs could begin to submit their readiness reviews, and all AEs need to have their readiness reviews submitted to ODP and approved by December 31st of this year. We're happy that Allegheny County is the first to submit and have their approved new management approach, and we're expecting them to begin to implement that right away. And assuming that we'll be seeing a lot more of the readiness plans come in from the AEs. Since the governor's February 2024 announcement, ODP reduced the adult waiting list by about 19%, and there are around 3,700 adults that are remaining on the emergency list. Again, that's still too many, but that's what our work with the growth strategy is going toward, trying to eliminate that. Since the February announcement in 2024, we've also seen an 8% increase in the total program capacity, which is resulting in about 40,000 individuals with intellectual disabilities and autism that can access home and community-based services. And the program capacity is around 41,555 right now. Next slide, please. Some updates in terms of performance-based contracting. I'll try not to repeat too much of what you've already heard. The 1915 B4 and C revisions were effective January 1st of 2025. We did make some revisions and published the implementation guide, and we have a link there for you to be able to access that. We did an information session January 29th, as well as an individual and family informational webinar on January 30th. We've got a link there to the recording that was posted on the website. There are also a series of virtual office hour sessions. There's one occurring right now, and I believe we've heard there's over 100 people that were registered to attend that session, which is wonderful. There are still 2 sessions remaining after today, one on the 7th and one on the 10th of March. And we have those times listed there for your reference. You can go ahead to the next slide. We just have some resources here for you in case you need to. I have some quick links to things. As Patrick mentioned, the portal is open for PDC submissions from residential providers until the 15th of March, and also open for pay for performance until the 15th of March. again, just some links to some helpful resources for you. Next slide, please. Just a quick timeline to show you sort of the progress of performance-based contracting for supports coordination organizations. You can see if you look around the upper third of that chart, we are nearing the public comment period for the waiver application, which we'll submit to CMS in July with implementation expected in January of 2026. Next slide. I wanted to talk just a little bit about the financial statement submission. I think there have been some questions about that. So we can let you know that we are nearing the final version of an updated announcement on the financial statement submissions. So the announcement will specify that residential providers will now only submit their financial statements as part of the PBC tier assignment submissions. We are asking that if you have audited statements, those be submitted. Otherwise, you can submit an enterprise-wide profit loss statement and balance sheet. SCOs will continue to upload their financial statements through the URL, which of course will be included in that announcement. Really what our goal is to analyze and really build a picture of what we want to see in terms of an organization's financial solvency and stability. At some point in the future, we may need to open an RFA for residential providers. And so we really want to, build a picture of what those standards might look like and what we might need to expect a provider to show in terms of being able to stand up a provider in Pennsylvania that is financially solvent. I feel like I went through that very quickly. Patrick, I think you had some additional questions or things for us, so I will turn it back to you.
Thank you very much, Jen. If there's questions, Craig, you can kind of monitor the Q&A. And thank you for addressing financial statement submission. We had gotten some questions, and I know we opened up a dialogue with you in the office, Jennifer. So appreciate that there's some clarification. So if any members have questions on that, please offer your questions as well. And as we go through, we will continue. So Jennifer, we'll go back to our deck, Craig, and we'll kind of look at the overall budget, related to a lot of the announcements. So maybe we'll circle back on some of the data. I think going through the budget will help us do that. So what we have, and Craig, if you can drop the handout that is kind of just the IDA section of the governor's proposed budget, as we bring the slide deck up, we're really going to have just some excerpts from that to kind of talk through and walk through. And I think this will help us get to some of the line items. And I know, Jen, as we kind of talked before this session, a lot of times there's specific initiatives. Like if you look last year, there was quite a bit because we had rates and performance-based contracting was new, so the proposed budget. And then, as we all know, there were a lot of changes made before the budget was enacted. But what I like to kind of show here, and this isn't the full page, I think this may be the second page of the handout. We have sort of a, what we think is kind of a tidier version out of the budget, which is like 800 plus pages long. There's about five or so pages that really get into intellectual disability services and autism services. So this is a little bit of a blowout in terms of what you see. What's been talked about a lot is really sort of this 175 million for annualization. So if you kind of look at that top right section, now there's other sections that address, I think, the state centers and community ICF down below on this actual page of the budget. But I guess, Jen, I'd probably focus on a couple of pieces here before I move to the next slide and we kind of blow out that upper right panel. The appropriation decrease in state centers, you sort of see a corresponding transfer to HCBS with intellectual disabilities. And that's what we always refer to as the augmentation account or the augmentation fund. So a few years ago, it was written into code that any savings from the state centers would go into basically community ID, basically be reserved for service needs. I know the department has used that for housing. And I believe there was just a bill by Representative Benninghoff introduced to sort of re-up all of this and make sure that a lot of the language moved forward. So I wanted to call that out first, Jen, and I'll pause just to see if you want to comment on that any further. But I want to call that out for members, most importantly. Last couple of years, we've been tracking this, and actually nothing moved last year. And we'll kind of get into the state center budget a few slides from now. But anything that you want to correct or clarify, Jennifer, in terms of that augmentation fund?
No, I don't have anything that I need to correct. I don't know, Kristen, if you had anything that you wanted to add there as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to add a little bit there. Background on that fund, the idea was that the any savings from the closures of state centers should stay squarely with people with IDA on the community side. And Benninghoff was responsible for adding, language in the fiscal code to make sure savings went into this specific fund. The fund had three allowable uses: housing, waiting list, and DSP quality initiatives. One of the other requirements with the from the fiscal code was that Isaac made a recommendation to the department for use, and Isaac very clearly recommended use for housing. And we have a housing subcommittee that essentially designed a supportive housing pilot, which is now in 10 counties. We're seeing some really nice success from it. I think the story will be able to tell, just looking at some of the cost savings that are coming out of, we haven't even hit quite 1 year of the pilot. And there's already some pretty good stories about overall cost savings to the system through the use of this, the supportive housing, which includes voucher plus supportive services. So, the issue that we're having is the way the fiscal code was written. It was any year where the state center appropriation is reduced, the amount of that reduction goes into the fund one time. So in terms of a sustainable source for these kind of housing vouchers, it doesn't quite fund that. And the bill that Benninghoff introduced is really aimed at trying to capture on an ongoing basis the savings from downsizing or closing state centers. So he's done some work to adjust the language so that savings would be captured ongoing, not just one time. So hopefully that will get some support in the General Assembly. Obviously, your advocacy would be really important for that because I think there's a lot of eagerness to expand that supportive housing pilot statewide, and without a funding source, we certainly would not be able to do that. So eager to see where that bill goes and hopefully provide that continued funding.
Thanks for all the added background, Kristen. And we've been actively involved. Nancy Murray here leading our committee has been really, I think, working directly with you. I know Senator Benninghoff as well. So, we're happy to see that legislation. Of course, we'd like to see more of that money move too. So that's another part of our advocacy. Probably kind of get to those real numbers as we get a little further on here. But I think we can go next slide, Craig. And it'll kind of blow out that upper quadrant. And so this is really the extent when you think about community IDA, and typically there's a little more to look at here. I'm glad Kristen has joined us because I think some of the things around waiting list, multi-year growth strategy, some of sort of the program side, and what the vision is of how things should change, can really be addressed in terms of some of this. But just in the hard numbers, you really see some transfers here. You see the fact that federal match. One of the reasons I wanted to call this out is because this is really at risk in terms of what's happening in federal level. So, this is speculation. We don't really know what's going to happen. And again, I want to call out the federal resources, the advocacy at the federal level, which we usually don't spend a lot of time here talking about, but that's why we wanted to open up the anchor portals. I wanted to make a correction to the earlier slide that I kind of paused on because it's supposed to be $880 billion. If you click the link, the article actually has that headline and the correct figure. So obviously it's hard to wrap your head around that much money. 50 states, federal government, they're looking to cut a huge amount of money. And as you can see, a lot, and this kind of unfolds as you look at the budget numbers, the budget is always in state-only dollars. But there's a big change here that just relates to the percentage change that state either year to year either has to backfill or sometimes gets a benefit from that. So Kristen, I don't know if this is a place you may want to comment on some of the use of ARPA monies this year versus next year, how it relates to performance-based contracting, if you'd like to do that.
Sure. So one of the things that when we were doing state budget last year, looking at performance-based contracting in particular, and the appropriation necessary to have the investment needed to support performance-based contracting, both for rate add-ons and for pay for performance. We had assumed that in the state appropriation. We were not assuming, we were assuming some ARPA funding for the pay for performance, but we were assuming it for this fiscal year. Because we ended up delaying the implementation of performance-based contracting, that most providers aren't submitting until now. We ended up sort of flip-flopping when the ARPA funds are going to be used. So we are actually, if you look at the pay for performance, we've got one payment happening this fiscal year that is coming out of state appropriation. If you look at next fiscal year, that is actually coming out of ARPA funding. So we flip-flop that just based on available funding and when we were going to be able to use that. Now, I do want to be clear, we also, in order to really maximize those ARPA funds, we are drawing down federal match on the ARPA funds as well. So if you read through the waiver, you will see that the funding that we're putting up to draw the federal match is actually ARPA funding. So we really have tried to, as much as possible, maximize those dollars so that we can really get an investment in the capacity building for credentialing tech and employment.
Okay, thanks, Kristen.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I think a lot of people, we have certainly referenced appropriation increase, $175 million, annualizations. I'll call out that there's always a number for annualization, so that's something that's in there. I'll say one of the things the associations talk about, and we certainly promoted a lot, we would like to see increases to the fee schedule rate. So that's sort of something where we would hope someday that might appear in an annualization, but we're still a long way off from really executing something. But we are continuing that work, and we're continuing to have that dialogue. So again, that's pretty simple and straightforward. So Craig, I think if you go next slide, this is where we want to sort of call out some top line numbers. And this is where you really sort of see the state center budget. And augmentation account, when that was created, I think it was probably like $110 million. Maybe it was 120. But as you can see, even moving forward with projection, it's been over $100 million every year. And it was, I think, the expectation we'd see more and more money moving out of that. So we want to call that up because just to give some scale, and then the potential of federal matching dollars, at least today's current levels, kind of pushes the number in current year, which is 108.7 million state dollars. That's potentially $246 million that we want to stay in the waiver. We want to stay in community ID. So it's something that we always want to call out for members. And if you go next slide, Craig, we're just going to kind of blow out.
Before you move on, though, I want to be realistic about this expectation as well. Selinsgrove and Ebensburg are not closing. We have over 200 residents in both of those facilities, and it's not like we see costs reducing there either. So in the near term, we have no intent to close either of those facilities. So I think in the near term, seeing this line decrease is fairly unlikely, or decreasing by any significant amount. The place where we'll see some decreases, which I guess are significant, if we actually finally sell. I don't know if people have been watching. There's been a lot of focus on the fact that we're still carrying the cost for Hamburg Center which we closed in 2018. Those costs fall on ODP. They fall on ODP until DGS, sells or does something else with those buildings. Same with Whitehaven, same with Polk. We also have the Woodhaven facility, which will be empty by this summer. Again, all of those costs for security, maintenance, et cetera, until the Commonwealth no longer owns those do still come out of ODP's budget. So we have tens of millions of dollars of savings there. But in terms of the operation of the existing facilities where we have people, those costs, I imagine, are going to be quite steady or increase. But offloading, property that's sitting vacant that we're taking care of would certainly we would absolutely have some tens of millions of dollars that we would be able to add to the augmentation fund.
Yeah, agreed, Kristen. And don't mean to imply that this is something that's going to happen tomorrow or even in, say, this legislative session. But these are legacy dollars, operating funds that have been in the system for a long time. And I think we want to make sure people understand and recognize and advocate for. We want that money to stay in the system. And secondarily, what you just mentioned, there's a lot of assets. And we understand, you don't want to be in the business of taking care of buildings. It's about taking care of people. And it's a lot of money. And you relate that to this most recent increase effective this year, it's about enough to do that another time. And that was not insignificant. So yeah, I think it's the importance of messaging. I appreciate the call. I don't want to give any member the impression that this is going to happen soon. But I think just like a discussion about an annual index or an annual adjustment, we started that conversation 5 years ago, at least. I think it's gained more traction over time. And before these funds would all go away somewhere else in the state budget or be absorbed into general fund, we certainly want to see that money stay in the IDA community services and the IDA specifically on the line item for communities. So thanks, Kristen, for that call out. And again, members understand that it's a long game on this, but there's still nevertheless a lot of funding, and not just what you see in these numbers here. There's a lot of assets, real estate, there's the liquidation cost potentially that we also want to make sure, whatever that is, that stays in the system for the benefit of the folks that we serve. So if we go to the next line, what I want to really call out here is sort of this bottom line number, and the fact that even though we don't have appropriation, combination of the things that you described, Kristen, with some of the transfers with ARPA, there's some backfill, but all in all, this budget doesn't go back far enough to sort of show, but I'm sure members who were participating in meetings and active with us or in the system at the time will recall that bottom left number, 2.290, basically almost 2.3 billion state dollars, that had been cut. The original number was about 2.49. It was a pretty healthy number. And then, we all saw a $170 million cut to the budget at a quarterly period where the legislature looks at tracking and looks at what's the actual going to be. And of course, this is very relevant to the pandemic and service contraction and things that we were all experiencing. But we saw that number go down to a level where we in the advocacy community, of course, complained about it. We said we saw money go away and then more money came out. It actually ended up being over $200 million decrease from what the governor had proposed down to that $2,290,000 figure that you see. So again, that's $2,290,000,000. These are in thousands. And then that gets leveraged to draw down the federal match at around the 55% right now. If you could look to this year, what's proposed, it's a very healthy number, even in a year we're not seeing initiative. But I think the vulnerability potentially, we want to be cognizant of that's a number that even our state legislature will be facing similar sort of questions as they look to the governor's budget and look to approve. So we want to be aware of that. I think that has implications for all of us. So want to call that out. Again, it's right from the statistics here. And generally speaking, we think that's a healthy number. We're pleased to see that number. We know that's driven by some other factors. We don't always see what's behind annualizations. People come into the system, oftentimes more costly. So there's a lot of factors here, but we're not in a position where the state looked at things, where the governor's budget office, and they took money from our appropriation. They did not do that. We want to try to preserve that particular number in state funds. Next slide, please, Craig. And so this is sort of an aggregation of the last couple of pages, and this gets into enrollments. And I think, Kristen, I know you said it, Isaac. I believe I'm kind of paraphrasing or quoting you correctly. We're trying to aggressively grow the system, and I think we see that, like in the previous slide. We see that in the financial projections that I don't think we've shown here, but they're in the handout. If you look at the projections going forward in terms of what the anticipated spending is for IDA services, it does increase year over year, and the projection goes out a bit further than this particular table does. But maybe this is an area, Kristen, you want to weigh in. I know this isn't the intent that we would see the waiver numbers stay where they are, but, and I know you don't write the budget, but is there any insight you can give us in terms of these waiver numbers? And maybe that'll lead us a little bit to a discussion. I'd like to follow up on some of the things you were talking about at Isaac about the waiting list itself and the PUNS process.
So I'm not sure how this are connected, but do you what do you mean?
You want me to start with it? Well, I guess where I would sort of go with this is you don't really see indications of growth in these waivers. And I guess why I throw the sort of the PUNS process in, I understand from your clarification at Isaac, PUNS is not intended to sort of look at folks who are in waivers, but they're not getting fully served. It's really to look at people who have no waiver, or they're in a waiver that is insufficient to meet their needs.
Correct.
So
Correct.
as we know, you've issued new waivers. I'm not questioning have those waivers been issued, but if you kind of try to reconcile that to this budget page, I don't see where we would see new additional waivers being projected. If I just kind of look at the estimated 25, 26,
the
we're not seeing that
this,
there.
Even the estimated for this year is lagging behind where we are. So I don't actually know the back end process of this, and Jen, I'm not sure if you know any better at which point in the cycle these sort of get updated, but we have exceeded the estimated for this year in terms of the waiver enrollment, at least on a couple of these. And then typically you'd see, this is historic, and again, I don't know the rationale for it, but the estimated for the next year is typically, as you can see, they don't actually change the numbers for the estimated. And I'm sure there's some reason in theory, and Jen, maybe you know what that is better than I do for this particular section of the book.
Yeah, and I only call it out because it's out there, of course, publicly. People see it and react to it, and we know it's not consistent with your messaging and the initiative. So just giving you a chance to say, yeah, we certainly understand the waivers are there. We recognize not everybody may be getting fully served, and we know there's a recovery. And I think that gets back to some of our compensation data. There's the work isn't done in terms of bringing back workforce, and we still know that combination of factors and some continued need for investment and some innovation there as well. But yeah, just only called it out for that reason, because we know what's being messaged. We know you're talking about waivers, and we see the money. So, I mean, hopefully that's what we want to preserve. So we know if we continue to see the funding, we can continue to get people moved off of the waiting list. Obviously they need to go somewhere, and that would be reflected here. I presumed it was probably just there's some lagging indicator element here. The budget office just doesn't really look at that kind
of. That's what I was going to mention, Patrick, and just in terms of time frames of when these numbers are published. They're submitted to the budget office months and months ahead. I think everyone's probably aware that our budget planning cycle is just about a year ahead of where we actually are. So the numbers get submitted to the budget office for inclusion in the governor's budget. However, those numbers don't actually get updated. So we're doing generally quarterly updates into the DHS budget office. But those numbers just don't get updated in the governor's executive budget or the subsequent documents. So as Kristen mentioned, the numbers you see here are lagging behind. And at the time that we have to make the projection for 25, 26, we don't even have the real numbers for 24, 25.
So maybe then, Jen and Kristen, like talking about real numbers. I know we just had this conversation the other day, Kristen. So putting the numbers behind what's really happening. I think you were reporting at Isaac, and we had the follow-up conversation that emergency waiting list for adults, right? That's the intent, that's the objective, that's what we're measuring. So 3,703 people, I think, is what you've quoted.
Right.
And then I think that was a starting figure of 4,629. So, and that's where the 20%
since last February, that's been the reduction, which is just incredible because that line has just grown for the last many, many years. We have only experienced growth in that in spite of all of the other waiting list initiatives that we've had. So, you know, we're really pleased with the success that we're seeing, and expect to be able to continue that trend line in terms of enrollment.
Yeah, and I think going back to like your explanation of the puns, I mean, it was helpful and insightful for me because I know here at our committee and among membership, yeah, that becomes sort of common point of conversation. We know folks aren't getting fully everything, and I know this sort of turned into a longer discussion about the utilization of services and how do we measure that. I know you made some comments about access rule, maybe down the road, but yeah, I'll stop there. I don't want to keep throwing stuff at
Yeah,
you. I think the
and
concept, if
I
you
have
can
to
kind of
jump to another meeting, but I will, it's a good opportunity to say this again, because I think there tends to be a ton of confusion about what the PUNS does and doesn't measure, and when we're talking about emergency list, what it is and isn't. The waiting list itself is very simple. All that PUNS is measuring, like PUNS is only to capture whether or not someone is enrolled in a waiver and whether they're enrolled in a waiver that can meet all of their needs. It does not address or look at, it is not meant to measure, it cannot measure whether or not someone is getting all of the services they need when they are enrolled in a waiver. So, it's, you know, if someone is considered unserved or underserved in terms of PUNS, that means they're on a PFDS, or unserved means they do not have a waiver. They do not have an ODP waiver. If they are underserved, it means they are enrolled in a PFDS or a community living, and they need, you know, the next waiver up to actually meet all of their needs. So I think there tends to be a lot of confusion about what we're measuring with that, and we've got to kind of clear that up. We do not have any kind of systematic way of measuring the amount of services that people need versus what they're getting. We have, you know, the way we do authorizations in the system has gotten very far away and very distorted from need, because we did things like instructed everyone to put 400 days of residential in a plan so that we're not going back and doing critical revisions. We instructed, you know, to put in all the different types of CPS. So you're not going back in and doing all kinds of critical revisions to make sure that someone can sort of fluidly receive what they need. So we've got a really big disconnect by policy, by things we have instructed the field, between those things. So we don't have a great way of looking at that. And I'm sorry, I really have to jump
I
to another
appreciate you being on,
meeting.
Kristen. Understood.
But thanks for letting me join this morning. I appreciate it. Thank
No,
you all.
thank
Have
you
a
for
great
being here.
weekend.
All right. You as well. Bye, Kristen. So Jen, I see a question we had from Lisa Ritter. If I'm understanding correctly, I think this goes back to the financial statements. You will review financial statements collectively to determine an expectation about solvency providers would be compared to others in the same service sector. So can you comment on that? I know this is formative, so I think I understand from speaking with both you and Kristen, but I just wanted to give you a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, we wouldn't really compare one provider to another in terms of decision making. The financial statements are really being reviewed for us to sort of determine what standards we need to have in place, and make adjustments to maybe what we need to have submitted in subsequent years. So it's not this is what you need to submit and this is what we're looking at right now in terms of making a decision for a tier assignment. It's really for us to get a better understanding of what types of standards will be needed to determine financial solvency. And as I mentioned earlier, at some point, there will be a need to put out an RFA. And so what kinds of standards do we need to include in the RFA to be able to determine whether an applicant would be able to successfully stand up a financially solvent provider in Pennsylvania?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jen. And you said the announcement was in development, forthcoming, and
I would expect it to be released. So that this is my first time running announcements through DHS, so I
yeah.
can't say for sure, but I would suspect that by the end of next week, we should be able to release that.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So,
Go through process.
Jen, thanks for being. I want to move on to sort of teeing up our breakout sessions. Craig, if you can go next slide, and then Jen, while we sort of transition into that, if there's anything that you want to talk about, I know the portal is open for basically the tier assignments for the residential providers who required to submit. I know it's early. I think Kristen mentioned to me yesterday, maybe it was like low double digits of people submissions you've actually received. So I know it's early in the process. Do you have any takeaways for us thus far on, things that have been recently posted to FAQs or anything you've seen in these original early submissions?
It's actually been really quiet, so we're hoping that that means that we've done a good job in communicating what's needed and doing the presentations, posting the recordings, and hosting the office hours. We're really hoping that that's been helpful to providers. As of this morning, around 8:30, we had 13 total submissions for performance-based contracting. 11 of those were for primary and 2 for select. And then we've had 3 submissions for pay for performance so far. So, we're expecting after the office hours today that might help maybe clear up some questions for folks, and they would begin to those submissions would begin to increase. And then probably same thing after the other 2 office hour sessions. So, just again, really encourage folks to make use of the resources that we have out there. Submit questions into the mailbox, and certainly attend those office hour sessions. Yeah, we were pleasantly surprised that the traffic in the mailbox and the types of questions that are being submitted are very, very minor. Very little.
Okay.
So
Well, good. I know we get a lot of questions as well. So obviously we'll keep in touch with you in the office and keep advising members on any information you put out, and have an ongoing dialogue about anything that we're hearing as well. But not a lot of uncertainty, I think, on the tool so far from our end. Just making sure people are aware. Everybody does need to do this. We'll save conversation. I know we're running short on time, and I want to be mindful of your schedule. Certainly, we want to get to a point of talking about the results and some of the timing, and obviously, our intent in the context of a budget discussion, we want to make sure that all of those funds get dispersed and encumbered, and that as many providers as can possibly get approved do. But we can certainly continue that discussion and dialogue going forward. And Jen, I want to really thank you for joining us today, sharing so much with our members. Have a great day and weekend, and I'm sure we'll have you back out soon.
thank you. It was great to join you today. Thanks for inviting me. I hope you all have a great weekend, and we'll talk soon.
Okay, thank you very much, Jen. And Craig, if I can allow you, I think I may have seen some questions that people had. I also, Craig, if you want to backtrack just a slide, I think you may have already dropped the link into the chat. So I'll just briefly say you'll need to click the link. There's only 2 breakout sessions. Certainly, if you want to take a break, please click the link and join your breakout session. Otherwise, you're likely that we may just divide the group after so many minutes so we can get everything started timely. But Craig, is there anything that you want to add in terms of tech and logistics?
No, I don't think so. If you miss when we close the meeting here, if you miss the link, check your email. If you registered, you should get the Zoom link for the breakouts.
Okay, thanks, Fred. Great. And is there anything, I know our guests have left. Is there anything that you think we can handle in the Q&A for any clarification or anything that was missed with our guests?
There were a couple questions about waitlist. We can certainly follow up with Kristen and Jen after the meeting and just see if they can comment on anything.
Yeah, let me jump in on that.
Question about the Medicaid funds.
Yeah, before you go to Medicaid funds, I just want to quickly say, I think we've recognized, the associations have had this conversation. So, on the letterhead and all the information that we put out, the 6 associations working together across the state. So we've really expressed to Kristen and to Secretary Art Kush, there's a real need for clarity on the objective and a pathway to strategically succeed. And I think that starts with some of the clarity and transparency on information. So really just this week, sort of learning the numbers I quoted, emergency waiting list for adults, we kind of need to know what that number is. I couldn't make the math work, and that's kind of how I said it to Kristen when I spoke with her. But having these numbers, then I could make the math work. So the numbers I quoted as to what the emergency waiting list according to ODP data is today, again, you don't see that reflected in things like the budget. So I think that even some of the things we didn't have a chance to get into today with the process of managing to budget versus slots is the way most commonly this seems to be referred at the AE level. We have many of AEs in our membership. So these are things that I think still need to evolve, but we are working to clarity on the waiting list. I'll just say at least that much. And then Craig, you said there was something on Medicaid.
Yeah, there was a question on with the potential Medicaid cuts coming. Is there any comment on how DHS and ODP are sort of preparing for that? I mean, again, we can follow up with the
Yeah,
department.
well, I think, if you've listened, you can listen to the recording of the secretary. And again, it's not brand new, but I think she addresses this, Kristen at Isaac on Wednesday. I'm not sure, I don't think there's a recording of Isaac, but it may be in the notes. I think the department and the administration continues to say they are very vigilant about what's going on. They are watching everything. They are advocating. They have put their links on their website with the data on services showing the direct impact to Pennsylvanians. So I think it goes back to, once they know something definitive, of course, they will take action on that. But again, we'll stay tuned to the extent we need to follow up directly with it. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and weekend.